Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message. You take your Bible and turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. We started this little journey off in Genesis with Joseph, the dreamer. And then we looked at the book of Joshua at Achan, and then last week in Samuel at Nabal. Today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, and actually we'll be in Daniel again next week. And this week we're going to be looking at Daniel's three friends. We've been killing Jesus. Leading up to Easter. This is the fourth of 5 sermons in the Old Testament, and we're going to have 5 sermons in the New Testament, ending on Easter Sunday with, of course, the death and resurrection of Christ. And there's just some things that you can't kill, and then there are some things that ought to die, like Achan, the thief, and like Nabal, the fool, and like David, the murderer. All those things in us, they need to die. And we need to ask the Lord to do a reviving work in us. His Spirit is the only thing that can really revive us and make us live again. And those things, the Achans and the Nabals and the Davids, they need to go away. Well, here's something today that needs to hang around. And that is what we find in Daniel's 3 friends. So if you're there in Daniel chapter 3, why don't we just read down through verse 7. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, nations, the languages, fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So here we have a very familiar story. We're very familiar with this. Nebuchadnezzar sets up an image in the plain of Dura. Now, this image it says in the King James, whose height was 80 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. It's about 100 feet tall. Okay, that's tall. If you want to compare it to something modern, in Scotland, they've actually created images of horse heads. They're called the Kelpies. And the Kelpies are each 100 feet tall and about as wide as this particular statue. And these horse heads are made of metal. Somewhere in Scotland, I'm not sure where, but they're called the Kelpies, and there's 2 of them, 100 feet tall. And when you see that they've done this in a park somewhere in Scotland, and when you see a person in relation to that 100-foot tall horse head, it's like, wow, that's big. Now, it's not as big as the Eiffel Tower, and it's not as big as the Statue of Liberty, and there are lots of things bigger than this statue, but for this day, this was big. And it was put out in the plain of Dura, so you could see this statue for miles away. And Nebuchadnezzar brought in everybody from every province. That meant that every district of his kingdom, no matter where it was, the leaders of that district, all of them came to Babylon and stood on the plain of Dura before this statue. So everybody in the kingdom, representatives from and notice how he puts it here, all the nations, all the languages of the Babylonian kingdom. So from as far away as Egypt in the southwest of the Babylonian kingdom, as far northwest as Anatolia and Turkey, as far east as he extended into Persia. That was the extent of the Babylonian kingdom. It was huge. And he reached into all those places, and so all those folks from all those districts came. And you notice he brings in the princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and all the rulers. So everybody who's somebody in these provinces has to come to this dedication. We talked about this today in Sunday school, in my Sunday school class. And I told the kids, I said, they said, well, what's a dedication? I said, well, it's like whenever you open something for the first time, you put a ribbon in front of the door, and all the dignitaries gather. The mayor comes, and the city council comes, and the sheriff comes, and the police captain, and the fire chief, and everybody shows up, and then you've got a great big pair of scissors, and you cut the ribbon. And then there's punch and cookies afterwards. Except in this case, there's a furnace. But, maybe there was punch and cookies if you didn't go to the furnace. I don't know. But usually there's punch and cookies with a dedication. So maybe they had punch and cookies. They had the furnace over here for the folks that didn't worship, and then they had punch and cookies over here for everybody that did. So they're at this dedication. Nebuchadnezzar says, you're going to bow down. And notice the command in Daniel chapter 3, verse 4. A herald cried aloud and said, to you it is commanded. So this is not a choice. This is the king's edict. Whoso falleth not down. So he gives not only the command, but he gives the threat. If you don't fall down and worship the golden image which Nebuchadnezzar has set up, then you're going into the burning fiery furnace. So there is no risk threat here. There's no benefit. Maybe there's cookies, I don't know, but generally the only benefit is you get to continue to breathe. That's it. So you either worship this God and continue to breathe, or you don't and you stop breathing. That's the choice that they have. And then verse 7, therefore at that time, what do? Everybody says, yes, sir, and they bow down. They worship the golden image. So the herald cries out, it's commanded, you're going to worship when you hear the music. And notice how they list all these instruments here. For the musicians among us, this is an interesting sort of listing. The cornet, flute. So those are two blown instruments, probably brass instruments or metal instruments of some kind. Well, the flute would be a woodwind. The harp, a stringed instrument. The sackbut is a stringed instrument. The psaltery is a stringed instrument. The dulcimer, I have one of those. That's a stringed instrument. All kinds of music. They probably had drums in there as well, something to keep the beat. So they had this wonderful band that Nebuchadnezzar had assembled with all these instruments. So those are just a few of the instruments in the band, and they're going to play music. And when you hear the music, then you bow. And so, of course, they do there in verse 7. They all bow down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So everything seems to be good until there's some tattletales. So we have some tattletales that show up. Verse 8, wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. And they spake and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, live forever. Thou, king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and not worship, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And the king's going, yes, 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 I know. I'm kind of wonderful that way. I did that. And then they say to him, there are certain Jews, whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Okay, so he says these tattletales, these guys ratting out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they say there are certain Jews who aren't doing what you say. Notice the accusation. First of all, they have not regarded thee. That is, they ignored the king's command. And you'll notice that they put in here not only that they're ignoring the king's command, but these are Jews that you set over the province of Babylon. So they're In a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, they're accusing Nebuchadnezzar of this. You didn't know good enough not to set Jews over the affairs of the province of Babylon, and when you did, you put in men who are going to ignore your command. Okay? So first of all, that's the big deal here. You've ignored. These Jews have ignored your command, which was to bow down and worship this huge statue. And then it goes on to say, they serve not thy gods. Now wait a minute. King Nebuchadnezzar knew that. He knew the Jews, he knew who they worshiped, and he knew that they weren't going to worship his God. I mean, he should have. These are Jews, so they're not going to worship anybody else. Right? I mean, shouldn't we say, yeah, that's what Jews do? The Shema is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. There are no other gods. There's only one. The very first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. So there's that. And I'm sure the king knew it. He had gone himself and sacked Jerusalem twice. He knew who these people were. He had destroyed the temple himself. So he knew all about the Jews and who they worship. So I don't understand why this is something that they would accuse the Jews of, except that they weren't pluralistic enough. You see, it's okay if you worship your God as long as you don't offend other people by not worshiping their God too. And then the third thing they say of the Jews, nor do they worship the golden image which you've set up. Now, you don't get punch and cookies for this. You go to the fiery furnace for this. And so Nebuchadnezzar, not only had they ignored the command to worship, but they don't worship his gods and they don't worship his image. Now, chapter 3 comes right on the heels of chapter 2. And do you remember what happened in chapter 2? Chapter 2 was Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And what did Nebuchadnezzar dream? He dreamed about this huge image that had a head of gold and shoulders of gold and a breast of silver, and then it was brass, and then it was iron, and then it was iron mixed with clay, and this huge image stood. And I just wonder if maybe Nebuchadnezzar didn't get a little bit big-headed, because Daniel said, you're the head of gold. Maybe he thought, well, if I dream about that, and God's telling me I'm the head of gold, maybe I need a gold statue to go along with that. And then he makes everybody worship his statue. And maybe it's a statue or an image of him. So they don't regard you, they don't serve your gods, and they don't worship the golden image which you've made. And Nebuchadnezzar had spent a lot of money on this golden image, and he was going to make sure that everybody worshiped it. Notice verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, he is mad. He says, you bring those boys and you bring them to me. He commands Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they brought these men before the king. Now, let's use our sanctified imagination for a minute. What do you think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing? You see, this conversation happens, and they don't know it's happening. They don't know that they're being told on by these people, right? I mean, this is happening in the king's courtroom, before the throne probably. And where's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, they're out doing their job. They're being the rulers of the province of Babylon. They're taking care of business, just like they've always taken care of business ever since Nebuchadnezzar appointed them to that place. So they're wherever they are during their day. Maybe they just got done with lunch and they're back in the office. Or perhaps they're out on some errand that has to do with the province and the keeping up of the province and, purchasing something that the province has to have, or overseeing the garrisons in the province, or who knows what it was. I'm sure they had huge administrative tasks that they had to take care of. But they're just out doing their thing, whatever that might be, in the middle of their day, and then suddenly on their door. And that's not a regular knock. And they knock again, and they open the door, and these soldier guys grab them. I'm sure that they weren't politely invited, because this is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not going to stand for anybody not to worship. And so the accusation's been made, and he, in his rage and fury, says, go get them, boys. And they bust into their office or bust into their home, and they drag them out, and they drag them before the king. And they're just